This is Thinker Be Eaten, and Larry's back with us to continue the series on We Are What We Hated. And I have to laugh too, Larry, because there are things that pop up every so often in politics here, governmentally too. And I would say they're mutually exclusive. But it becomes obvious to those of us who have taken a little look behind the curtain that what we're talking about, that, and I wouldn't even call it vestiges because it's alive and well, that they're still with us. And every so often it gets a little more draconian, and people are always going to accept it because it looks like a solution to a problem. However, they're the problem makers, and they are the solution providers. And every time that does happen, we head more and more into a status situation. And as it pertains to what you were talking about, just the other day I was reading Trading with the Enemy Act and the Banking Act of 33, and what a funky bunch of things went down at that time. And they're with us today. Although they don't like to talk about it, it's still with us. And perhaps one of the first steps in really accelerating that situation took place after World War II, when everybody kind of kicked back in America, is understood, and just, got into buying a house in suburbia, in Levittown, maybe got that first car, popped out 2 kids, life was good, leave it to Beaver, everything's fine. And I would say while we slept, the scumbags were pretty much at work.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty apropos.
Yeah, and I think one of the greatest contributing factors to this investing the spirit of the United States would be what you're going to speak to today, which never is mentioned in history books or anything. We think all the Nazis died or went down a hole in Nuremberg and are gone. But like a lot of those science fiction movies, where you think the good guys win, and then all of a sudden, as they're ready to go to the outro credits, something happens where it's like, oh, they're back.
Yeah.
So
the sad part about the Nazis is they never went away. Many of the higher ups, or at least some very key criminal Nazis. I mean, it kind of goes. It's kind of a one of those terms that is a double thing there.
Yeah, double
what's criminal and what's Nazi.
Yeah,
but kind of redundant. But many of them escaped, and with the help of the U.S. and I might say. They got an awful lot of help from certain individuals within the government of the United States and within the U.S. military.
I'm not going to send you off somewhere that you're not planning to go. Just got to ask you this question, and a yes or no will suffice for now.
Okay.
I'm guessing it's going to be a yes, but is it known that certain principals in the Nazi regime escaped Nuremberg?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I would think that would be the case, or some of them got out before they even went to the trials, so I would assume so.
Some did, and some went to the trials and got out anyway.
There you go. Okay. All right, so take us on this next part of our trip. Who does this involve, or what does this involve?
This Paperclip conspiracy, I'd like to read an opening statement that's kind of general, but a very good statement by Christopher Simpson in his book Blowback, which is America's recruitment of Nazis and its disastrous effect on our domestic and foreign policy. And in there he writes, in the final analysis, the Cold War became the means for tens of thousands of Nazi criminals to avoid responsibility for the murders they had committed. The breakdown of East-West cooperation in the prosecution of war criminals, motivated again in part by the short-term interests of the intelligence agencies on both sides in protecting their clandestine operations assets, provided both the means for criminals to escape to the West and the alibis for them to use once they arrived here. Nazi criminals, as Simon Wiesenthal has commented, were the principal beneficiaries of the Cold War. There are moments in history when small events clarify much bigger patterns, and such is the case with the CIA's recruitment of Nazis during the 1940s and 50s. Here one sees the extent of the corruption of American ideals that has taken place in the name of fighting communism. No one, it seemed, not even Adolf Eichmann's personal staff, was too tainted to be rejected by the CIA recruiters, at least not as long as his relationship with the U.S. government could be kept secret. The American people deserve better from their government. There's nothing to be gained by permitting U.S. intelligence agencies to continue to conceal the true scope of their association with the Nazi criminals in the wake of World War II. Well, I agree with Simpson on that, but I think it's way too late for that, and I think he's just showing himself to be very optimistic, and I'm not so optimistic about that situation.
Okay.
Next up, there were several really good books and articles that I read about the what's called the Project Paperclip. One of those is a book by Tom Bauer called The Paperclip Conspiracy. I'll read a few quotes from him. The Paperclip Conspiracy was the climax of an astonishing battle between allies in the aftermath of the war to seize the spoils of Nazi Germany. A successful plot by senior officers in the Pentagon to rewrite the wartime record of brilliant German scientists. Men who were classified as ardent Nazis were chosen just weeks after Hitler's defeat to become, quote, respectable American citizens. Some in Britain, too, conspired to employ Nazis, seeing that as their last chance for economic recovery, but were opposed by outraged officials, which argued that while they argued their erstwhile allies had advantageously hired the most incriminated Germans, the French and the Russians took on anyone regardless of their crimes, and the Americans, through a taut web of deceit, sanitized the murderous record of Nazi scientists. Revealed for the first time the despair lies in calculating ruthlessness of Allied politicians, officers, servants, and businessmen, who after 5 years of bitter war openly began fighting amongst themselves about the plunders and profits of victory. The pawns in the middle were the men, machines, and secrets of the Third Reich, but the ultimate victors were the Germans themselves. Neil Armstrong's epic landing on the moon in 1969 was courtesy of two groups of Germans, Werner von Braun's rocket team, which approved the use of slave labor to build the V-2 rocket, and the German aviation doctors, whose pioneering experiments had included fatal tests on the inmates at Dachau. Talking about earlier with the Eichmann illusion that he had come up with, and Baron von Otto von Bolschwing was the guy that that Simpson was talking about. Recently, there was an article in the New York Times that basically the title of the article is "Long Hidden Report: CIA Created Safe Haven for Nazis in the U.S." And this was written in the Times in November 13, 2010. So there's an article about that article written by Catherine Smith entitled "SS Veteran of Eichmann's Jewish Affairs, Otto von Bolschwing." This is a long-hidden report, CIA created safe haven for Nazis in the U.S., obtained by the New York Times, November 13, 2010, may be the most concrete account yet of the role that prominent members of Germany's Nazi Party played in the early formative years of the CIA following World War II. The report alleges that the CIA created a safe haven for Nazis believed to be of use to the U.S. Cold War efforts. The report confirms what some refer to as a pathetic chapter in our nation's history. The experts our intelligence people recruited were just a bunch of criminals and losers that never provided any useful intelligence about the Soviet Union. Furthermore, Lieutenant Richard Halleck had a breakthrough in 1943 when he deciphered the codes of the Red Army intelligence in the Verona Project. One part of the report addresses the story of Otto von Bolschwing, an associate of Adolf Eichmann, who was instrumental in drawing up plans for ridding Germany of the Jews. Here's an excerpt again from Simpson's book, Blowback, where he says, the story of U.S. intelligence relations with criminals such as Brunner is of necessity fragmentary, for both the CIA and Brunner himself have taken extensive measures to keep such affairs hidden. It is clear, however, that Brunner was not an exception to the rule who managed to ingratiate himself with the Americans through guile or through an oversight. There is, in fact, at least one other known case of U.S. recruitment. Baron Otto von Bolschwing, an SS veteran of Adolf Eichmann's Jewish Affairs Office, the elite committee that served as the central administrative apparatus of the Nazis' campaign to exterminate the Jews. Von Bolschwing, deeply involved in intelligence work and in the persecution of innocent people for most of his adult life, was a supreme opportunist who succeeded in traversing the whole evolution of U.S. policy toward Nazi criminals. He had profited during the war from the Nazi confiscation of Jewish property, then later from the defeat of Nazi Germany itself. Von Bolschwing enlisted as a CIC informer for the Americans in the spring of 1945. Well, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg there as far as the type of people and the numbers of Nazis that were allowed to escape during Project Paperclip. I have an article that I thought was pretty enlightening by a man named Dr. Richard Brightman, a professor of history at American University. It kind of sums up a lot of the Paperclip episode, and I read some of that to you.
Mm-hmm.
After World War II ended in 1945, victorious Russian and American intelligence teams began a treasure hunt throughout occupied Germany for military and scientific booty. They were looking for things like new rocket and aircraft designs, medicines, and electronics, but they were also hunting down the most precious spoils of all, the scientists whose work had nearly won the war for Germany, the engineers and intelligence officers of the Nazi war machine. The U.S. military rounded up Nazi scientists and brought them to America. It had originally intended merely to debrief them and send them back to Germany, but when it realized the extent of the scientists' knowledge and expertise, the War Department decided it would be a waste to send the scientists home. Following the discovery of flying discs, the Foo Fighters, particle laser beam weaponry, and German military bases, the War Department decided that NASA and the CIA must control this technology and the Nazi engineers that had worked on this technology. Of course, NASA didn't come along until a lot later, but it was kind of generated by the Nazi scientists. It was generated by Nazi scientists.
Not that you have to know this, but I'm just curious. Are you saying that they were a principal cause, or did they really give NASA muscle which it hadn't had previously?
Well, I think they were basically the principal cause for the idea of exploration of space. I think Werner von Braun, who was the most famous and probably the top guy amongst the Nazi rocket scientists, he had been working on an idea for space travel since I think the 1930s, maybe even the 20s. So I think that they kind of gave the idea, I'm sure that probably amongst American scientists, there might have been some wild idea about space, but once they began to see the research that these guys had done and how far they had gotten with it, I think it encouraged them to want to have, the creation of NASA.
Well, when Colvin comes on, he speaks to it too. He kind of, that's part of what he likes to do as far as research.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, whoever the scientists were involved with the Nazis and in rocketry, I'm sure that some of the stuff we're not even aware of that's available, or actually it's in reality capable, but we don't get to see it, was already concocted by them. So I'm sure they were, for whatever reason, they had a certain kind of a talent for that. Now, do you know, and I should know this too, sorry, but I mean, before there was NASA, was there jet propulsion labs?
I think there were, Biz.
Yeah,
but they were real primitive compared to what the Nazis had. I think, in fact, the British were ahead of us, and the Nazis were way ahead of them.
Yes.
And I think that was what one of the main things they were looking for was, the idea of jet propulsion and eventually the idea of space exploration.
Okay.
I was going to go on with this article.
Yep.
The War Department's Joint Intelligence Objective Agency, which is JIOA, conducted background investigations on the scientists. In 1947, JIOA Director Bosquet Webb submitted the first set of scientist dossiers to the State and Justice Department for review. The dossiers were damning. Samuel Klaus, the State Department's representative on the JIOA board, claimed that all the scientists in this first batch were ardent Nazis. Their visa requests were denied. Webb was furious. He wrote a memo warning that the best interest of the United States had been subjugated to the efforts expended in beating a dead Nazi horse. Well, wasn't that nice? He also declared that the return of these scientists to Germany, where they could be exploited by America's enemies, presented a far greater security risk to this country than any former Nazi affiliations which they may have had, or even any Nazi sympathies that they may still have. When the JIOA formed to investigate the backgrounds and form dossiers on the Nazis, the Nazi intelligence leader, Reinhard Gehlen, met with the CIA director, Alan Dulles. Dulles and Gehlen hit it off immediately. Well, why wouldn't they? They were both Nazis. Gehlen was a master spy for the Nazis and had infiltrated Russia with his vast Nazi intelligence network. Dulles promised Gehlen that his intelligence unit was safe in the CIA, and that was true. In a 1985 expose in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Linda Hunt wrote that she'd examined more than 130 reports on Project Paperclip subjects, and every one had been changed to eliminate the security threat classification. A good example of how these dossiers were changed is the case of Werner von Braun. A 1947 report on the German rocket scientist stated, "Subject is regarded as a potential threat by the military governor." The following February, a new security evaluation of von Braun was done. No derogatory information is available on the subject. It is the opinion of the military governor that he may not constitute a security threat for the United States. Here are a few of the 700 suspicious characters who were allowed to immigrate through Project Paperclip. And first one is Arthur Rudolph. During the war, Rudolph was operations director of the metalwork factory at the Dora Nordhausen concentration camps, where 20,000 workers died from beatings, hangings, and starvation. Rudolph had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1931, and a 1945 military file on him said simply 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat, suggest internment. But the JIOA's final dossier on him said there was nothing in his records indicating he was a war criminal or an ardent Nazi or otherwise objectionable. Rudolph became a U.S. citizen and later designed the Saturn V rocket used in the Apollo moon landings. In 1984, when his war record was finally investigated, he fled to West Germany. It goes on to Werner von Braun. From 1937 to 1945, von Braun was the technical director of the Peenemünde Rocket Research Center, where the V-2 rocket, which devastated England, was developed. As noted previously, his dossier was rewritten, but he didn't appear to have been an enthusiastic Nazi. Von Braun worked on guided missiles for the U.S. Army and was later director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He became a celebrity in the 1950s and early 60s as one of Walt Disney's experts on the world of tomorrow. In 1970, he became NASA's associate administrator. Then we go on to Kurt Blohm. A high-ranking Nazi scientist, Blohm told U.S. military interrogators in 1945 that he had been ordered in 1943 to experiment with plague vaccines on concentration camp prisoners. He was tried at Nuremberg in 1947 on charges of practicing euthanasia, extermination of sick prisoners, and conducting experiments on humans. Although acquitted, his earlier admissions were well known, and it was generally accepted that he had indeed participated in the gruesome experiments. Well, there you go. There's an example of a person who actually should have faced the gallows, or at least imprisonment, at Nuremberg, but was let off the hook because he had some information as a scientist that they wanted. 2 months, 2 months after his Nuremberg acquittal, Blohm was interviewed at Camp David, Maryland, about biological warfare. In 1951, he was hired by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps to work on chemical warfare. His file neglected to mention Nuremberg. Then there's Major General Walter Schreiber. According to Linda Hunt's article, the U.S. military tribunal at Nuremberg had heard evidence that Schreiber had assigned doctors to experiment on concentration camp prisoners and had made funds available for such experimentation. The assistant prosecutor said the evidence would have convicted Schreiber if the Soviets, who held him from 1945 to 1948, had made him available for trial.
What do you think he was doing in the meantime?
Again, Schreiber's paperclip file made no mention of this evidence. The project found work for him at the Air Force School of Medicine at Randolph Field in Texas. That's in San Antonio. When columnist Drew Pearson publicized the Nuremberg evidence in 1952, the negative publicity led the JIOA, says Hunt, to arrange a visa and a job for Schreiber in Argentina, where his daughter was living. On May 22nd, 1952, he was flown to Argentina, Buenos Aires. That's kind of interesting how they all kind of wound up in Argentina over the years.
Well, I mean, maybe later on, but it's interesting that South America itself has a connection to the old world also.
Oh, yeah. You know, Juan Perón himself was a fascist. He was, dictator of Argentina, and he was a good friend with both Hitler and Mussolini. I say good friend. I know he was a friendly associate of them, and a ton of Nazis escaped there through the rat lines of the Vatican. And this is not a big deal because we're doing it now also, the United States military. But I remember, again, film clips from back in the late 40s, early 50s, whenever Allende got in there, or Pinochet, and maybe even before them, I don't know. But what always struck me is because as a kid, I think if you remember watching war clips or war movies, the Nazis had different helmets than the United States did, right? Mm-hmm. And the Brits were also different than the other two. Mm-hmm. But the Nazi helmet, though it's probably the best one of the bunch, was adopted by the militaries down in Argentina and Chile. And it always struck me, it's like, does that mean something? So I'm not saying it does, but again, you know that there's yeah, it definitely did. And they got a lot of instruction from Nazis that came down there. Yeah, their militaries. In fact, I'm going to get into that a little bit later.
Okay.
With a man named Klaus Barbie. You've probably heard of Klaus Barbie. Most people have, but
he's an inventor of the Barbie doll, isn't he? No, that's somebody else. That's somebody else. Cheap shot. Yeah, Klaus Barbie, and then even up to the present day, it was only a couple of years ago that Nazi bastion, Colonia Dignidad, got busted.
Yeah.
And everybody acts like, was that going on? No.
Yeah, I'm planning to read some stuff from the guy who wrote about it long before he got busted, Peter Levenda.
That's right.
And I'm going to read a section that he wrote about Barbie. In fact, in his book, Unholy Alliance, and we might get into this in a later show about the influence of the Nazis in South America, which is considerable. And, in fact, the Nazis made an attempt to get into many places in the Spanish-speaking world long before World War II. In fact, they established German colonies in several countries in South America. I believe as early as around the time of World War I, or even earlier, in the 1920s and 30s. They increased their influence down there. That was part of their idea of world domination was to establish colonies.
Well, I find interesting, for instance, Germany's connection with the Mexican government around World War I, a kind of a murky chapter for Americans about our own history. But with Wilson getting ready to invade them, and of course, this is a little bit of trivia, but I still think it's interesting because I always liked when the band did this. The band would every so often kind of do a folk song based on history. Like, for instance, Acadian Driftwood. Now, right. Warren Zevon did one called Veracruz, which I think is very interesting. And so we were beating our chest off the coast of Mexico, and I think Germany probably at that time also took the opportunity to kind of feel out the Mexican government, hence the Zimmerman note, where if they would kind of come in with the Germans, then they would get whatever land they lost, et cetera, et cetera. Now, also in the Western Hemisphere, and it's not so much that I think the nations of South America, for instance, were so, fond, enamored of the Nazis or the German cause or whatever. But you have to remember also that one of the common elements to this whole story is the Vatican. And where did the Vatican go to start its first reduction camps? And that was in South America. The movie The Mission tells you about that. and that goes back to, I think, the 16th century. So there was plenty of old world influence in the Western Hemisphere, especially in South America. And now we see what, centuries later, the Nazis get out, and who could have that kind of power to get them out of Germany and into the Western Hemisphere? So, there's a lot going on there in the 20th century between South America, Central America, and actually Mexico's North America.
Yeah.
And
considered to be.
Huh?
It's considered to be
That's
for
right,
purposes
right.
of the Union.
Yeah, and for history textbooks and geography classes.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, let me just throw that out there because I don't think it was anything necessarily favorable in, let's just say, South American nations' governments that they thought the Nazis were so cool, but there was obviously an undercover conduit between Germany and South America.
Well, I think, like most governments in the world, or maybe all governments, the people in South America are nationalistic, and they're not particularly wanting to be run by some foreign power. But there was a great deal of, like I say, immigration to South America, and many of the most prominent families in, say, countries like Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, even Colombia to some extent, and some of the other countries. Some of the most important citizens, the most wealthy and powerful people in those countries were either German immigrants or like second or third generation, that had been immigrants. And they had a great deal of influence in there. And, yes, there was, among the upper classes, the elites within South America, many of them did favor the Nazis. It favored a fascist-style rule. And I think that's pretty obvious from, the old joke about banana republics.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this will be a good time to read about Klaus Barbie.
Yep.
And this is from Peter Levenda's Unholy Alliance, A History of the Nazi Involvement with the Occult. And he's talking about Barbie, who was one of the people who escaped prosecution as a Nazi. Barbie became Gestapo chief of the French city of Lyon in November 1942. It is from that point on that his record of barbarity and cruelty, a record that earned him the nickname the Butcher of Lyon, was begun. Barbie was responsible for sadistic, horrific crimes against the Jews, communists, and the French resistance. He took a particular delight in interrogations and eyewitness accounts of his participation in torture of men and women in the basement cells of Montluc prison are enough to turn anyone's stomach. In the case of Marquis leader André de Vigny, for example, Barbie ordered his pet Alsatian to attack the defenseless prisoner, a man who had already been subjected to savage beatings, cold water treatment, and injections and red-hot irons placed on the soles of his feet. The dog began by ripping de Vigny's clothing from his body with his fangs, and then continued by tearing the man's flesh from his bones. Miraculously, de Vigny survived this encounter with Barbie and went down in French resistance history as the only prisoner ever to escape from Montluc prison.
That guy lived?
He lived.
Oh.
That was amazing to me, too, when I read it. Unfortunately, the use of trained, vicious dogs as interrogation and torture tools also survived and was implemented with gusto in the Nazi fortress and cult center in the Chile town known as Colonia Dignidad, which we talked about earlier. At the end of the war, and with a price on his head and a warrant for his arrest, Barbie managed to find employment with American intelligence in Germany, specifically for the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC. As a Nazi-turned informer and spy, Barbie entered into such illustrious company as Reinhard Gehlen, Otto Skorzeny, and SS Colonel Freddie Schwind. Barbie soon proved very useful to his American handlers, developing an intelligence network that extended from penetrations within French intelligence all the way to Eastern European immigrant groups and intelligence services there. But Europe got too hot for Barbie. Wanted by the French for war crimes committed in Lyon, Barbie knew his days of enjoying the patronage of his American superiors was drawing to a close. The Americans could not afford to let Barbie fall into French hands for fear that he would reveal American intelligence operations against them. To the Americans, the French intelligence service was riddled through with communists and could not be trusted. They spent almost as much time spying on their allies as they did keeping tabs on the Soviet Union. So they arranged his escape along the rat line to South America. And for this purpose, they used the offices of a Croatian priest. Dr. Krunoslav Draganovic himself was a war criminal and fascist and a member of the dread pro-Nazi Ustashi. Wanted by the Yugoslav authorities, but he enjoyed the protection of the Vatican nonetheless. Like Barbie, Father Draganovic was also in good company. He was not the only Catholic priest in Yugoslavia accused of war crimes. The atrocities committed under the aegis of the fascist state of Croatia, formed in 1941 under Ante Pavelic, outdid even the Nazis for sheer brutality. While the Jews were certainly on the list, so were the approximately 2 million Eastern Orthodox Serbs who were forced either to convert to Catholicism or be put to death. Even conversion was no guarantee of safety, as many new converts, men, women, and children, were dragged from their first Mass and executed on the streets outside the churches. One Franciscan priest was the commandant of a Croatian concentration camp. Actions such as these mitigate against Vatican protestations of innocence or the equally disingenuous argument that an accommodation had to be reached with the Nazis to prevent further bloodshed. These were the people Draganovic represented, for which an arrest warrant was issued. Although he never served any time in prison, was never tried in any court of law. This is the man who arranged Barbie's escape for the CIC. After a series of adventures, Barbie found himself and his entire family a new home in Bolivia in 1951 with a visa made out in the name of Father Rok Romak, the pseudonym of yet another Croat war criminal priest, a Franciscan who administered to his newfound flock in the area of Cochabamba. And for a while, Barbie was the perfect bourgeois businessman. Then forming and cementing relationships with the underground Nazi cult in South America, and among men such as Skorzeny, Freddie Schwinn, Eichmann, and many others, Barbie, as Klaus Altmann, began to carve out a position of influence in the varying shifting military regimes in La Paz. It will be remembered that Bolivia had been host to German immigrants for years before the war and was a target of U.S. intelligence efforts to neutralize their influence on Bolivia's political life. Barbie fell in with the German immigrant community and linked up with wheeler-dealer Freddie Schwinn and eventually Italian pro-fascist terrorist Stefano Delle Caie, I guess, found himself a lucrative position as a lieutenant colonel in the Bolivian intelligence. Schwinn and Barbie began running guns between Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. Using their contacts in the Kameraden work, the informal association of SS officers organized by Luftwaffe ace and Hitler pet Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, and among the more fascist of the various Latin American governments who became their clients and occasionally their suppliers as well. The gun trade eventually led them into the real drug trade, where the abilities of Barbie as a military organizer were enhanced by the arrival of Stefano Delle Caie. Del Caie enjoyed a serious reputation abroad as a master terrorist who had been responsible for a series of lethal bombings throughout Italy in the late 60s. He'd also been involved in the aborted military takeover of the country in 1970 and had to flee Italy from the relative safety of Franco's Spain. It was in Spain that he met and cultivated El Brujo, Argentina's own version of Rudolf Hess, Jose Lopez Rega, self-professed Rosicrucian, Peronista, mystical advisor to Isabel Perón, and founder of the notorious AAA death squads, and a member of Propaganda Due, P2, the secret Masonic society dedicated to the overthrow of the Italian government and its replacement by a fascist regime. Lopez Rega was an intimate of such men as P2 founder Licio Gelli, who spent many of his post-war years in exile in Argentina plotting to restore pro-fascist, anti-communist governments in South America, as well as in Europe, and using his own version of Hitler's dangerous element, the initiatory secret society P2, as his vehicle for bank manipulations and the subversion of governments. Del Caie would also become involved with Michael Vernon Townley, the American terrorist and spy who planned and organized the assassination of former Allende minister Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Chile's secret police, the DINA. Talley, of course, was a frequent visitor and advisor to Colonia Dignidad. With all this talent cropping up in Bolivia, it was inevitable that the phenomenon known as narco-terrorism would be born. Elements of Italian, Argentine, and Bolivian mercenaries, trained and led by former SS officers, formed the security detail known as the melodramatically nomenclature Fiancés of Death for Bolivia's drug smugglers, and even warded off violent attack from Colombia's rival Medellin cartel. For some time it seemed that Barbie and his friends could not reach any higher, and then came 1980 and the Garcia Meza military coup, masterminded in part by Klaus Barbie and Stefano Del Calle, and funded by Argentina intelligence and the shadowy P2. The coup ushered in a new period of severe and brutal military repression in the country, as perhaps could be expected of a government created and managed by drug smugglers, terrorists, fascists, and Nazi war criminals. Carlos Leder's inspiration had obviously been the Meza Barbie coup, and Nazi gatherings took place openly in La Paz, complete with swastika banners and raucous singing of the horse vessel song in Bolivian clubs and bars. Barbie continued as chief of internal intelligence, and Del Calle went abroad to forge links between the government of Bolivia and such legendary homicidal madmen as Major Roberto de Aubizon of El Salvador, the man who ordered the assassination of Bishop Romero. At home, Barbie concentrated on removing all opposition to his growing narcotics trade with the approval and assistance of the government. Eventually, though the sadistic dream had come to an end, Del Calle was fingered in the bombing in August 1980 of the railroad station in Bologna, Italy, in which 84 passengers died. He dropped from view, narrowly escaping capture. The foreign press had already identified Barbie as the Butcher of Lyon, wanted by the French government, and slowly Barbie's spiderweb would begin to unravel. A civilian government was elected in Bolivia by a population finally driven to outrage by the excesses of the cocaine army, and in February 1983, Barbie was extradited to France to stand trial almost 40 years after the end of World War II. Barbie's story is instructive for two reasons. In the first place, it demonstrates the danger and continuing threat of the Nazi underground against political regimes all over the world. In the second place, Barbie remained a committed Nazi, a man who bought into the cult of Nazism with his whole heart and soul, and who never ever lost faith with the religion of Hitler, Himmler, Hess, and Rosenberg. The racial conceits, the anti-Christian, pro-pagan ideology, the anti-communist crusade, it was all present in Barbie's reign of terror in Bolivia, and included the other organizers of neo-Nazi intrigue, Skorzeny and Rudel. Drugs, guns, murder for hire, military coups, instruction in Nazi torture and interrogation techniques, Nazi nightclubs, and the horse vessel song. These are all the hallmarks of what is often mistakenly referred to as neo-Nazism. There was nothing neo about Klaus Barbie. He was the genuine article, and there was nothing neo about Colonia Dignidad, the latest in a long line of concentration camps and cult centers, courtesy of the Third Reich. Well, that's an awful lot of stuff there to discuss, but it points out how that it just seems like the evil specter of Nazism seems to hang over just about any kind of a criminal enterprise that is going on in the world today, and I'm obviously referring to drug running and gun running, which obviously Barbie was involved with. In fact, he was one of the people who took over the government of a sovereign nation in South America and Bolivia.
But all those vices, if you will, have found themselves resonant, in a lot of cultures. I mean, here we are ourselves, denying that we got involved in anything like that. And of course, the most prominent example, I guess, that has been swept under the rug is that the whole Iran-Contra situation.
Right.
where there clearly was drug running into the United States. I mean, it was so, well, I wouldn't say it's so obvious, but as I think you've heard me say, I mean, Pilot Pete on 2 separate occasions with 2 different pilots both recounted that they had bridged their military service till the time when they got involved with commercial airliners with running stuff for Iran-Contra-Gate.
Right.
So, and it goes on to this day. Let's face it. I mean, come on. And
yeah, we may have talked briefly in one of these discussions we've had about Mena, Arkansas.
Yeah.
And I think Mena, Arkansas, which was a very tiny airport outside a very small town in Arkansas, it's kind of like a microcosm of the criminal underground in this country, where agents of the federal government and I guess you could say the mafia, whoever you want to say they are, but it just shows the connections there. It also shows how phony the whole Democrat-Republican thing is in this country when you consider that the Bush family and the CIA was in league with the Clinton operation down there in Arkansas. The state police there were well aware of what was going on. There's been a great deal of evidence there pointing to that. And Clinton, as the governor of Arkansas at the time, turned a blind eye to those operations, and I think that probably had a lot to do with allowing him to become elected president of the United States.
Yeah, I don't know where this DVD is, if it's on YouTube or not. I haven't taken a look, but the Clinton Chronicles is pretty good stuff. And just like as you said, during the filming of the documentary, there were a number of Arkansas Bureau of investigators, agents who talked about what they had on Clinton and that whole operation, and they kind of like, as I always said, look kind of whimsically into the camera and go, and he got away. So,
yeah, yeah. Well, they were up against I think a lot of them at first were not aware of what they were up against, and they pursued their investigations. Some of them, were intimidated away from it. There were even some people that were probably killed as a result of trying to penetrate into that operation. It certainly wasn't above the Clinton gang to intimidate or even kill somebody, according to the evidence that I've seen.
There's a book entitled Drug Politics by David C. Jordan, I believe is the name. I don't know that he gets involved too much with naming names, and I certainly don't remember him fingering any political figures of high profile here in the United States. But what he does write about is that there's no doubt in the world that global economy, to a great extent, is involved with what he called narco-statistician of economies. Mm-hmm. And he was a former U.S. ambassador to, I believe, Peru. And I was surprised even at what he wrote, for whatever he did write. And so I'm not getting down on him for admitting other things, whether he knew that or not. But again, it gives you he writes about it in a very taciturn manner, as if to say, this is the way it is, folks. Are you okay with that? And just leaves the scene. And I would ask people if they're interested in reading kind of a pretty good indictment of the fact that governments are complicit with global drug trafficking. That would be a good place to start. Also, there's a book that was mentioned to me by a listener, The Bluegrass Conspiracy, about what went on up there. I mean, this is some of the most in-your-face, obvious, but at the same time invisible enterprise. I mean, it goes on down here. We are all aware of it. It went on up in the Northeast, which you can pretty much hide because it's obviously congested and a lot of things are going on.
Right.
But down here, I mean, when they have a C-130 pass over you and out of the rear end comes a bunch of palletized bales of grass, and nobody knows anything. Everybody's D&D.
Yeah, sadly enough, during the Clinton Chronicles and some other research, it's been pointed out. I've seen interviews with the kid's mother, one of the boys' mothers, but there were a couple of kids in Arkansas who were just goofing around, like I guess they were like 14, 15-year-old boys goofing around.
Right.
And they they apparently saw a drug drop, and they tried to set it up saying that these kids had fallen asleep on the railroad tracks. Now, even a person who is severely mentally retarded would not sleep on railroad tracks, and you know, there's stuff like that. Apparently, they had been killed by the people, maybe in the Arkansas police that were involved with it, or maybe by the feds, but somebody set them up, killed them, and the way that they covered it up was just ridiculous. They had the Clinton appointed coroner, just kind of whitewashed the whole thing, and they got away with it.
Their mother, I think, was interviewed for that Clinton Chronicles.
Right.
I mean, it was both.
It was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
As a parent, and the anger and just anguish that person must feel that their child was killed by these criminals and can't do anything about it. I think that's the worst part about it, and I kind of relate to that in a lot of things that I see going on. Criminal activities that are condoned and even participated in by the government. It makes you angry, but there's so little you can do about it. It's like, when the cops are criminals, where do you go?
Yeah, I made much about how much the movie Invasion from Mars had struck me, because when I was a kid watching it, one of the things you don't want to know is that the cops aren't on your side.
Right.
And of course, in that movie, what does the little kid do when he sees what's going on? And that is that people, Martians have come down and they're starting to zombie-ize people in his town, to include his parents. And he goes in and he tells the cops, and the cops look at him very understandingly. And I'm sure you remember this scene too, Larry. And the camera pulls out from behind the cop who's listening to the boy. And as he pulls back, you see he's got one of those little implants in his neck, and you're like, "Oh no, man! Don't tell me this."
Yeah.
But you know what?
I do remember that.
Yeah, and I mean that was very upsetting.
And it kind of shocked me when I saw it. I guess I saw it in the 50s or 60s when I was a kid, and it had the same effect on me. Like, wow, I never thought about that, But the cops could well not be your friend.
And there was a writer whose name I forget, who's on an interview with David Susskind, and this is probably very early 70s.
Right.
And one of the things he was asked, I don't know why Susskind asked him, like, well, what disturbs you the most, or what frightens you the most? And he said, being alone in the subway with just a cop.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't impugn all police. He's just saying in that situation, there's no way in the world, whatever happens, you can ever prove if something goes wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, he is the reigning power there. But that also applies to the whole macrocosm of the conspiracy situation with you're involved in and so many others. And of course, anyone who's listening in this understands this. But what we found out, of course, with the informer in Montgomery, and that is, guess what, folks? Your government's a fairy tale too. And that's that's the last thing I found. I'm like, holy mackerel, and then it came back to me, that bit about, the movie and how I felt, and it's like, well, guess what? Here we are. So
I'll tell you, when it really hit home to me in recent years was during 9/11, when at first I was stunned. I couldn't figure out what had gone down. And then I began to think, well, this whole scenario just doesn't make sense. It's a lot like the Kennedy assassination. And I began to look into it, and as I started looking into it and saw these strange anomalies, it finally dawned on me, we really are out there alone. If they would do such a thing or allow such a thing to happen, which
I know.
And I was just for an entire month or so, I was just like crushed by that, thinking, man, here I'd spent all these years kind of keeping quiet and trying to ignore a lot of things, and it was no longer possible.
As heinous as that for us to understand, because we do believe it, and rightfully so, can you imagine how people who have no clue about what's going on could ever accept what the deal is? And but you see, it's been with us forever, and yet it's been covered up forever.
Right.
And the one that Lusitania series I did, I mean, there you see how it can happen. And even in the age of mass communications and television and all that, it isn't that big a deal. I mean, stuff that has gotten out with regard to 9/11 that they don't want you to hear or see again was out there, and people captured it. So you see, even though there were kind of clues that there was government involvement with it, it's gone away. And anybody who produces those clips, for some reason, I mean, they never get a chance to be on the mainstream. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And we're not going there, but again, that situation expressly with the Pentagon, and oh man, I'm trying not to forget the guy's name. I did a thing on it, Jamie McIntyre.
Right.
When I went ahead and I played what he said on 9/11 when he was at the Pentagon, and then we played the little bite that CNN gave McIntyre when he came back saying, "Oh, my own words are being used against me," and how CNN danced around the indicting parts of what he had said that day at 9/11. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at this. I mean, this is the perfect anatomy of cover-up and damage control. It happened in broad daylight, but anybody who was sitting at home watching this on TV, if they had gone to their computer and plugged in McIntyre, plus 9/11 plus Pentagon, you would have heard exactly what he said. And what he said that day is refuted. He's trying to debunk it, but he is lying about it straight out.
Right. Well, yeah, you caught him in the lie. I mean, I've heard both segments, and it's obvious that he's lying, and about what he had said.
But what about the duplicity of CNN to start with the audio bite of the original 9/11 reportage, and then when it gets to the good stuff, they fade it out, they throw in some underlying music, a little theme music in the background, and McIntyre goes into his overvoice. Right. So, in other words, for all those who said, well, he didn't say that because I watched the CNN report, you didn't hear anything of any consequence on the original audio they were playing on that show. And that should tell you that if they didn't do it, what does that mean?
Well, one thing it means is that the government of the United States and the corporations who really control the government of the United States, the corporate elite which controls it, has absolute total control over the mainstream media. I mean, nothing gets shown, and nothing is put out there that they don't want shown or they don't want known about. And I think it was maybe Dulles who or maybe one of the people in the CIA, maybe Casey or Donovan, who once said that there was a giant Wurlitzer. In other words, like a jukebox. He was talking about the media. There are tons of people within the American mainstream media who are either on the CIA payroll, and some of them are actually CIA operatives, and these people put out disinformation, and misinformation, to go along with the military-industrial complex, point of view. They discovered a long time ago, I say they, the elites, the New World Order, if you like, they discovered a long time ago that you control the public when you control the media. And they bought up the newspapers in the late 19th century, and then they bought up the radio and television networks later on, whenever that became, the medium of mass, and we are probably, in my opinion, I can't really verify this, but I say we as the United States, Americans, are the most propagandized, the most completely mesmerized people in the world. I mean, I think Europeans have a little bit better, I think the same kind of thing goes on through their governments, but I think they have a little bit better perspective on the world, and I'm sure that's probably true in South America, Asia, etc.
Well, how's this for you? People wonder why I went down the rabbit hole. But one of the things that happened in the 70s is I played for a semi-pro club whose owner-manager was a lawyer, and he was kind of an eccentric guy, like who am I to talk? But I never really knew what he did for a living. I never really asked him, but he had all this time to devote to the baseball team, which is kind of tough when everybody's working 40 hours and Usually these guys are they're either retired or they're owners of their own business. I never asked. Not a big deal. Years later, I leave that team to play for another team whose manager is FBI.
Right.
Now, later on, he tells me that they had a plant in the FBI, and it happened to be the owner-manager of my former team. I think he might have worked in accounting. I'm not sure. Now, to make things really interesting, my father-in-law used to work for the New York Times and knew the individual who was the lawyer. And I told him that, and he looked at me. I'm going, I know. That's the way the life goes. So you see, I mean, that was an innocuous example to a certain extent. I mean, that was FBI and stuff, and the New York office handled that, and they were in the Times. They were everywhere. I mean, nobody knows.
Yeah. There was I wish I'd been prepared to discuss this subject better. I could do a better job, but I know that back in the 70s there was an article in Rolling Stone which went into extensive detail about, the intelligence agencies, and in particular the CIA, and how they control the media and how they have people that are basically on their payroll throughout the spectrum of the American mainstream media, and especially the New York Times and the Washington Post.
And you know what's, not that you're asking me, but the Rolling Stone, when I see that whatever that is now, and I compare it to what it was back in the 70s, what's so funny is now the Rolling Stone has plants in their organization, and I'm definitely accusing Taibbi of being one of them. Matt Taibbi.
Probably is. I'm not that familiar with him. I remember he's made some kind of inflammatory statements from time to time.
Well, the thing is, and this is why I got into it with Freak Lemon, I don't care what he does on Wall Street, because whatever he does on Wall Street, he's allowed to do. But then here's the other thing. After the story's over, what happens? Nothing. And as a result, I think that people are allowed to give those who are critical of a certain political body or economic body, whatever, in this case, Wall Street, they get all ticked off, they read it, they realize, it's really crooked, then nothing happens.
Right.
Because the government doesn't dare touch them because they're not allowed to. But then,
this thing with Wall Street is just amazing. I remember you and I discussed this in January of 2010. I was on the show. We were talking about the Wall Street bailout, which had taken place, a short period of time before. And we were talking about how that they were bringing these guys up in front of Congress, and the guy from Goldman Sachs, I believe it was, I forgot his name, but he was very defiant, and almost like, giving the finger to Congress,
Yes.
And the congressmen are up there, and they're trying to look good in front of their constituents, but it was all a dog and pony show. They wanted to look good in front of the constituents, and they wanted to have somebody, to wag their finger at, and nobody's been convicted of anything. These people are giving themselves big bonuses, having a great time, making more money, and they robbed the American taxpayer of trillions of dollars. Nobody even knows how much money they've taken. And they're just sitting there fat and happy, and the American public has gotten screwed. But we'll never recover from that financially. The government never will.
No,
and I mean, if people don't see that as the beginning of a tremendous collapse of the government of the United States, then they're just not dealing, with a full deck.
Well, in that case, somebody has to connect the dots for them, but they are probably loath to want to stick around and hear something they don't want to hear. Right. But I mean, just in passing, when I was in a store with somebody I've seen enough now that, I guess you feel comfortable saying it. And I'm saying, and we were talking about this, and I'm saying, we have no government, and she agreed. And I said, look, every time Wall Street goes ahead and gets banged for doing something, what happens? Oh, maybe indictments are raised. I have no idea, because the thing is, they don't report on it. It goes away. People forget. Now, you can bet the Wall Street honchos got their bonuses everywhere last year, but I thought they would throw it in people's faces. They didn't. They said nothing about it. But they didn't say they didn't get them. And now, of course, here we are, in April of, obviously, the past year, 4 months after, and nobody remembers. Nobody knows.
No.
But nobody swings in banking, really. Maybe a couple are given up for whatever reason. But the whole thing goes on.
It's an incredible it's just incredible the American public doesn't, just come at the Congress in waves, screaming and hollering, protesting, threatening, to throw everybody out of office for not doing something about Wall Street.
Well,
and nothing's done.
I think one of the reasons why the Tea Party was bred, and that it's not a grassroots organization, don't even bother me. They were brought up to take a lot of the not disenfranchised, a lot of these people who defected were Republicans who were probably of decent means.
Well, the Tea Party's being basically financed by the Koch brothers.
Yep.
These are extremely wealthy businessmen with a, quote, libertarian point of view, which is basically, get rid of government altogether. Everything should be run by corporations, which is
well, there you go.
What does Mussolini say? Corporatism, it should be the real definition of fascism.
So so just holding you right there, what you said, they could serve a function for two purposes. Mm-hmm. They're born out of the Republican Party, which is seen as always being business friendly, Wall Street friendly. So now those people who are educated enough and are willing to take a look around, who have found out that things are not good, like their big thing is we now know the Federal Reserve is a private bank. Well, that's great. A little knowledge is dangerous.
But Bully hoorah for you.
Well, yeah, but
it's been there for about 100 years, but they just now discovered that idea.
But you see here, what they've done is they've given a voice to some people who might have made a difference. And when you like I said, you let the heat out of a hot kitchen, and of course, obviously, the whole inflammatory situation starts to fade away. But the other thing is what you've said. So now they got these people going, less government, less government, less government. But then what happens? What fills in the void? And that is corporations who already run the show. So what these people are doing unwittingly is aiding and abetting what they would never want to have happen if it was drawn out for them. But there they go. So they are going to be.
What's the end result? The end result is corporate fascism.
It's here now.
We've been talking about that for an awful long time, and people just don't get it. They can come at you, with all kinds of beguiling ideas about, and this thing about we're going to take the country back. You never owned the country in the first place.
Well, I mean, it's like I said on this last Stuff and Things. I said it before though, and I think it's true. You ask people to be patriotic. You ask people to be patriotic when you want to tax them more and when you want to kill them. But corporations, no, it's laissez-faire. Keep your hands off them. They might get upset. Who gives a crap? They leave anyway. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, how come they don't get to be patriotic, but we have to be?
They've totally deindustrialized the economy of the United States. I mean, it's over. I mean, I don't know how long it's going to take the American public to figure that out. But the good jobs, the manufacturing jobs that used to be the backbone of America in the 50s and 60s, and I know that my father was an industrial worker, and he made a good living, and we had a fairly decent, standard of living like a lot of Americans did because, he had a good job in a manufacturing company. That's not there anymore.
It's
going away, and people just don't get it.
It's gone away. It's 40 decades of capital and industrial manufacturing flight. And nobody along the line just said, why are we letting this happen? And it happens all the time. It continues to happen, and nobody says very much about it. And if they do, it never seems to get to Congress because they don't do anything about it. And there's a reason why that all happens. And it gets as banal as this. Lady Biz bought a cane because my right leg's not doing too well these days. And I look at it the other day, and it's made in China.
Sure.
And I'm like, why could we make this here? I mean, why am I walking around with a Chinese cane, which will probably give out when I really need it? So, you that yellow horde. Anyway, so I mean that's how it's gotten. So in other words, we do live in the reality of this, but people who see some of this stuff accept the explanations that come to them by their government and by mainstream news. They try to get personalities in there that people will trust, like O'Reilly and Beck, who's the most dangerous individual on TV right now.
Glenn Drek, yeah.
No, he's a nasty boy. No,
yeah, he's a real creep.
Yeah, he's the biggest press.
I hate it when he cries too. The guy does.
Oh, he's
crying.
good, isn't he? Oh,
what
damn,
is that
he's
all
good.
About, you know?
He is definitely good. That's
Like
probably because they're
I
holding
guess
up.
he has an onion there. He gets into it or something.
Oh, they're probably holding up one of his kids with a knife. If you don't do what we tell you to do, Glenn, the kid gets it. All right. So again, as one of our shows disintegrates into anarchy, does that bring us to the end of the road with this chapter on the Operation Paperclip? Now, is that also known as the rat line?
No, actually, it's two different things. A rat line,
Okay.
was just the avenue by which the Nazis were escaping from Europe. But they were related in a way. But
Yeah,
Project
okay.
Paperclip was actually a government operation where they would get mainly Nazi scientists.
Okay,
I
so
have one other set of things to discuss on it, and that'll be the end of it.
sure, go ahead.
There's a very good article about Project Paperclip, related to Project Paperclip, and it's called How the U.S. Government Created the Drug Problem in the United States by Michael E. Krecka. It's in LouRockwell.com, sort of a conservative magazine, online magazine. But it starts off with 18th century German philosopher George Frederick Hegel long ago developed, among other things, what he called the principle of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, to explain the process of deliberately enacted social disorder and change as a road to power. To achieve a desired result, one deliberately creates a situation, a thesis, devises a solution to solve the problems created by the situation, and an antithesis, with the final result being the ultimate goal of more power and control, synthesis. It is unsurprising that Karl Marx and his disciples like Lenin and Trotsky, as well as the U.S. government, in its so-called war on drugs, made this process a keystone of their drive for total control of all individual actions that, in their views, were not, in Mussolini's terms, inside the state, and thus controllable by the same. In 1942, OSS Director and Army Major General William Wild Bill Donovan began his search for an effective truth serum to be used on POWs and captured spies. Beginning with a budget of $5,000 and the blessing of President Franklin Roosevelt, he enlisted the aid of a few prominent physicians and psychiatrists like George Estabrooks and Harry Murray, as well as former Prohibition agent and notorious Federal Bureau of Narcotics Director Harry Anslinger. And then it goes on to talk about the people that were brought over with Project Paperclip and how that became involved with this program to find drugs for mind control. Unsurprisingly, the extensive wartime German experiments with various hallucinogenic drugs at the Dachau concentration camp, directed by one Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later honored as the father of aviation medicine, aroused great interest in the USA, especially after an October 1945 Navy technical mission to Dachau reported in detail on Strughold's work. So great, in fact, that when the OSS and its successor, the CIA, imported 800 German scientists of various specialties under the auspices of the infamous Project Paperclip during 1945, it made sure to include Dr. Strughold. Dr. Strughold's barbaric medical experiments, for which his subordinates were tried and convicted as war criminals at Nuremberg, were nothing more than a series of bizarre and unspeakably brutal tortures. Even so, he learned a lot about human behavior in mescaline, a natural alkaloid present in the peyote cactus. Mescaline, long central to many Native American religious rituals and first chemically isolated in 1896, is a phenethylamine whose ergoline skeleton is also contained in lysergic acid. To our Cold War spy masters, ex-Nazis like Dr. Strughold were definitely evil, but they were definitely useful as well. Well, I don't think they cared whether he was evil. I think they were themselves. But anyway, this pervasive amoral pragmatism led, of course, to the extensive and notorious MK-Ultra experiments, in which for nearly 25 years, thousands of everyday Americans, both military and civilian, were heavily dosed with numerous very potent artificial psychoactive drugs, often without their knowledge or consent. MK-Ultra was first organized in 1949 by Richard Helms under the direction of Alan Dulles. You knew Alan Dulles was in there somewhere. As Project Bluebird. 2 years later, it was renamed Artichoke after one of Dulles' favorite foods. Oh, well. Then termed MK Ultra in 1953, finally becoming MK Search in 65 until the program's official termination 8 years later. MK Ultra was directly responsible for the wide underground availability of LSD, PCP, DMT, STP, and other powerful synthetic psychoactive drugs in the 60s. In the early 1950s, the CIA and the Army had contacted Sandoz requesting several kilograms of LSD for use in the test program. Dr. Hoffman and Sandoz refused this request, so Director Dulles persuaded the Indianapolis-based pharmaceutical luminary Eli Lilly, later the pioneers and chief cheerleaders for the widely prescribed antidepressant Prozac, to synthesize the drug contrary to existing international patent accords, making the U.S. government and Lilly the first illegal domestic manufacturers and distributors of LSD. They were distributed via the agency's sometimes allies in organized crime and through the FBI's counterintelligence operations, COINTELPRO, directed against various activist groups in the period. The actual definition of the term MK Ultra remains unclear, but a former Army Special Forces Captain John McCarthy, who ran the CIA's Saigon-based Operation Cherry, which targeted the Cambodian ruler Prince Sihanouk for assassination, claimed that MK Ultra stood for manufacturing killers utilizing lethal tradecraft requiring assassination. Well, that's nice. Propaganda in its simplest form is condemning one's opponent publicly for what one is doing himself. Dulles, of course, was that very outside genius. 3 days after warning assembled Princetonians about the disturbing ramification of these techniques, he had directed MK Ultra researchers to perfect them. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's expert on lethal poisons, who reputedly was the inspiration for director Stanley Kubrick's bizarre Dr. Strangelove, character played by Peter Sellers in the 1964 film of the same title, headed up the operation as director of the chemical division of the technical services staff via a front organization called the Society for Human Ecology, distributed $25 million in drug research grants to Harvard, Stanford, UC Berkeley, and other institutions. By the end of the 1950s, the CIA was funding just about every qualified LSD researcher and psychologist it could find through such contractors as the Society for the Study of Human Ecology, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and the Geschleiter Fund for Medical Research. Author John Marks, in his 1975 book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, identified the CIA's LSD research pioneers as Dr. Robert Hyde at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, Dr. Harold Abramson at Mount Sinai Hospital and Columbia University in New York City, Dr. Carl Pfeiffer at the University of Illinois Medical Branch, Champaign-Urbana, Dr. Harris Isbell of the NIMH-sponsored Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Louis Jolian West at the University of Oklahoma-Stillwater, and Dr. Harold Hodge at the University of Rochester. The public memories of that particular era were carefully, this is talking about the 60s, I skipped over something there, but I should read this part. It would become supreme irony that the CIA's enormous search for weapons among drugs fueled by the hope that spies could control life with genius and machines will wind up helping to create the wandering, uncontrollable minds of the counterculture. Admiral's son and musician Jim Morrison led the Doors of Perception. A quartet of Liverpudlians sang Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds while the Rolling Stones dropped transparent hints about drugs. To take a lesson from Orwell, what is more important about the 1960s, indeed, about any period in history, is not so much what really happened as how that period is remembered publicly decades later. The public memories of that particular era were carefully manipulated in great part by the deliberate creation and promotion via television and the recording industry of the phony and in reality quite small drug, rock, hippie subculture. The first underground LSD labs were actually set up by the FBI in 1963 in both New York City and San Francisco. Many began to incorrectly confuse the ancient medical art of herbalism with the shenanigans of amateur basement flower power and biker chemists. Overenthusiastic pitchmen like social psychologist Dr. Timothy Leary and beat poet Allen Ginsberg sadly failed to sufficiently stress that key difference, although the technically competent Leary clearly understood the artificial high potency of LSD. Leary and his longtime associate psychologist Richard Alpert matured professionally in a CIA-funded research world. In 1948, Leary, then a UC Berkeley graduate student, attended the yearly convention of the left-wing American Veterans Council in Milwaukee. There he met CIA officer Cord Meyer. Meyer's professional specialty was infiltrating and discrediting various organizations deemed un-American or disloyal. Meyer persuaded Leary to help him. Leary acknowledged Meyer's influence, crediting him with helping me understand my political, cultural role more clearly. During 1954 and 59, Leary was the director of clinical research and psychology at the Kaiser Foundation Hospital in Oakland, California. The personality test that made him famous, the Leary, was actually used by the CIA to test prospective employees. Leary's Harvard associates included former chief OSS psychologist Harry Murray, who had monitored the early OSS truth serum experiments, and numerous other knowing CIA contractors. One of Dr. Murray's many test subjects was a Harvard undergraduate math major named, drumroll please, Theodore Kaczynski. In the spring of 1963, Leary and Alpert left Harvard and founded the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, later renamed the Castalia Foundation, on a 2,500-acre estate in the small upstate New York community of Millbrook. There, the pair of psychologists continued their hallucinogenic drug research and soon became the chief investigative target of an ambitious Dutchess County district attorney named G. Gordon Liddy. Multimillionaire William Mellon Hitchcock generously bankrolled the founding and operation of IFIF Castalia and later financed a huge black market LSD manufacturing operation. It was also well within CIA policy to randomly distribute LSD laced with the lethal poison strychnine so as to create horror stories useful as propaganda. Dr. Hoffman himself chemically confirmed the presence of pure strychnine in several random street samples of LSD. Consistent with its policy of deliberately confusing the beneficial ancient herbs with extremely dangerous synthetic alkaloid derivatives, the CIA surreptitiously distributed these synthetic compounds termed psychedelics to the public. One of them was STP, originally developed as an incapacitating agent for the Army in 1964 at Dow Chemical. Dow even made the STP formula public information 3 years later. This potent synthetic put many unsuspecting people on a 3-day trip and sent many hysterical with anxiety to the emergency room. That, of course, was the purpose of its distribution. During 1955 to 75, the Army tested LSD, termed EA-1729, and PCP on several of its enlisted men at what was then the headquarters of its chemical corps, Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Something described in detail by Bill Curtis in his televised 1995 A&E investigative report segment titled Bad Trip at Edgewood. The CIA also tested PCP in conjunction with electroshock therapy and sleep deprivation at Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal under the direction of the notorious Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron. Excess doses of PCP, reported the CIA, could lead to convulsions and death. Soon PCP was flooding the streets. Edgewood also received an average of 400 product rejects a month from major U.S. pharmaceutical firms. These rejects were actually drugs found to be commercially useless because of their demonstrated hazards and numerous undesirable bad effects. In 1958, Edgewood obtained its first sample of a reject called, I'm just going to call it BZ, developed by a pharmaceutical giant Hoffman LaRoche, later known by its street nickname as brown acid. BZ, some 10,000 times as powerful as LSD, inhibits the production of hormones which aid the brain's transfer of messages and instructions across nerve endings, thereby severely disrupting normal human perceptual, behavioral, and sensory patterns. Its effects generally last about 3 days, although symptoms, migraine headaches, giddiness, disorientation, auditory and visual hallucinations, and erratic, if not maniacal behavior could persist for as long as 6 weeks. During the period of acute effects, noted an Army physician, the person is completely out of touch with his environment. The Army also developed artillery shells and rockets with warheads able to deliver large doses of BZ to selected targets. Man, that would be amazing to be on a battlefield and have somebody blast you with brown acid. Not good. In the summer of 1964, beat novelist Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who had been an MK Ultra test subject at Stanford along with Allen Ginsberg and Grateful Dead musician Bob Hunter, launched a year-long cross-country trip in a day-glow painted school bus filled with his friends called the Merry Pranksters. The Merry Pranksters distributed thousands of doses of LSD along the way, a phenomenon colorfully described in author Tom Wolfe's 1969 novel, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Yeah. Supplied by one Ronald Hadley Stark. Stark, who died in 1984, was a CIA operative, fluent in 5 languages, with access to unlimited public funds and numerous high-level contacts in business and government throughout the world. For instance, when the underground manufacture and distribution of LSD was suddenly derailed in 1969 due to the scarcity of its key ingredient, ergotamine tartrate, and increasing federal law enforcement pressure, Stark, via the Laguna Beach, California-based Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a small group of local surfers led by chemist Nicholas Sand, got it quickly back on track. For 5 years, Stark, aided by the Castle Bank of the Bahamas, which pioneered the art of money laundering for the mob, and his contacts in a French pharmaceutical firm, facilitated the mass production and distribution via the Brotherhood and other groups. An even more powerful strain of LSD, nicknamed Orange Sunshine. This firm also manufactured BZ. Stark, who operated LSD labs in Brussels and Paris as well, claimed he was going to supply Orange Sunshine as an offensive weapon to CIA-backed Tibetan rebels fighting the Chinese occupation. Stark also was a close friend of the Los Angeles founders of a small breakaway Scientology sect called the Process Church of the Final Judgment. English expatriates Robert de Grimson Moore and Marianne McLean. Regular attendees of the Process Church included members of the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, and other prominent pop performers, as well as an ex-convict and wannabe rock musician named Charlie Manson. Manson and his followers became heavy users of Orange Sunshine, the trademark bad acid of the day, which they were all on when, on Manson's orders, they carried out the brutal August 1969 Tate LaBianca murders. When Stark, who is believed to have distributed an estimated 50 million doses of LSD during his agency career, was arrested for drug trafficking in Bologna in 1975, Italian magistrate Giorgio Floridia ordered his release on the grounds that he had been a CIA agent since 1960. Judge Floridia documented and justified this using a list of Stark's numerous intelligence contacts. These were and are all classic government COINTELPRO style tricks. This is how natural herbs and their mild pharmaceutical grade derivatives were quickly and easily made lethal and consequently demonized. How was this done? First, foolish claims were made that there was no difference between safe whole herbs and their potentially deadly ultra-refined alkaloids. Next, the best of the traditional herbs and the milder of the pharmaceutical grade alkaloid derivatives were made unavailable. And finally, the streets were flooded with potentially deadly synthetics. Deliberate perversions of science like angel dust continue to be a great propaganda tool for our die-hard drug warriors, and the worn catch-all excuse of the interest of national security is used to justify appalling covert drug capers ranging from CIA sponsoring heroin production and trafficking in Southeast Asia in the 60s to the Bush-Clinton Mena, Arkansas, Nicaragua, cocaine for arms smuggling schemes in the 1980s. These constitution-shredding police-state methods were adapted from the Nazis and the Soviets by and large and were applied by the CIA NSA, DEA, BATF, IRS, and FBI against us. Scores of groups, ranging from the American Indian Movement and Black Panthers to militias and religious organizations like the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, were either disrupted by agent provocateur-style riots, bombings, and armed standoffs, smeared the mainstream news media through the Reichstag fire approach, or in the case of the Davidians, physically exterminated. The war on some drugs is merely a horrible extension and intensification of those tried and true Hegelian methods of a war in which we shall all lose. I know there's quite a bit of material there, but thought it was very interesting, and that was all the result of the Nazi scientist, and in particular one guy, Mr. Struggold, Hubertus Struggold, who was a medical experimenter on the people at the concentration camps. And this is, Nazi science brought to fruition in how the CIA used those experimentations.
This is a continuum that's been going on for millennia, and I think you and I believe to a certain extent that though we know that the world will go on for a millennia after it all hits the fan, I think as far as human history is going to be written up until this point, where we have some kind of event, and I think you and I agree that it's going to be a war, and it's going to be nasty, and what happens on the other side will not be good, and it will not, I don't believe, last that long. Be that as it may. But when I look at all that's going on, and I'm not going to pin everything on German people or Nazis. I mean, it was just something that happened, and it was passed along, because right now, it's here. I mean,
right.
we look at China and Russia, bad guys and all that stuff, but you know what? All the elements that are needed to push this world to where certain individuals, and of course you and I look at it as spiritual as well, where they want that to go, is happening right now. So, not to beat on the Nazis or the Germans or any fascist organizations, not to excuse them either. It's just that what we're trying to say is that it's happening here. Would you agree with that?
I sure would, and I'd even add one thing.
Sure.
In our first couple of episodes when we were discussing the topic of Nazism and its influence on America and how we became what we hated, we talked about extensively the satanic roots of Nazism, and that's where it all goes back. Mm-hmm. And that's what Nazism is to me, is a tremendously large, very powerful, complex satanic cult. So that still exists today.
But isn't it interesting? And this makes perfect sense because of the irony. And that is this country which is misconceived and poorly remembered as being some kind of bastion for Christianity,
right,
would be picked, I think, to carry whatever that is, the last number of yards, the backstretch, or whatever you want to call it. Because, we were, God shed His grace on us, and we were Protestant, and all, stop. And that's what we were saying about the Society of Jesus, too. Well, they're not bad. They have the name Jesus in their title. Okay, great. Don't you understand, folks?
To the simple-minded, that seems to work. That's all they need.
To the complicated-minded, it also is the same way, because those who think they know everything are blinded by this whole situation.
That's true, too.
So, here we are. And what I resent is the fact that we are going to be, and most Americans are not going to understand. We are the vectors for this last virulent round of destruction, I guess you have to say, to suit certain entities' purposes. And I know that's really kind of nebulous, but still in all, we're the ones now who are going to be, quote, gifted with this really bad shit sandwich. So it's hard to wake up every morning and watch politicians pontificate and talk about our core values. It's like, what would they be necessarily? So that's what I feel badly about, is because we're going to be the ones that enable this, whatever it is, to get to its final stage. So
right.
I'll throw it to you, Larry, if you want to close this out.
Well, like I always say, that all the Nazis were not in Germany.
Right.
And just the term Nazi really doesn't mean a lot. It's a mindset, and it is a satanic mindset that exists in certain individuals and even in large groups all over the world. There is from what I can tell and for all the research I've done, this was a long time in coming, and it was built up during the 1930s and 40s, and it's still with us today, and they're very powerful people in many countries in the world. They're involved in it. A lot of people don't realize that this really is the New World Order. I mean, it has for lack of a better term, a Nazi background. It's building up, and it's getting more powerful. And the New World Order is here. It's been here. And like I said the other day, I really feel sorry for people who are delusional and think that they can stop this. I mean, it's going to happen in my viewpoint. I have faith that it's going to happen, that there is going to be a quote New World Order that totally dominates the world in the future, prior to the return of Jesus Christ, who will set things right. But it's coming down Main Street, and I don't know why people can't see it.
Well,
and it's not going to get any better. And this country is going to take a real tumble. I think we're going to get crushed as a nation, and I don't necessarily take joy in that. There's a certain amount of vestiges of patriotism left within me. That there's certain things about America I love, but I can't stop this, and there are very powerful forces behind it. And I guess the America that I loved is very similar to the America that Jim Garrison talked about. But the thing was, and you pointed out, is that it really never was like that. It's just an idealized America. A country where we have representative government and we have civil rights and all these wonderful things that we believe in, the freedoms that we believe in, and a commitment to decency and a decent life for people. But that's not the future, or at least the immediate future. All of those things are going to be taken away, and we're going to be forced into a new feudalism, those of us that will still be around after what I believe will be a third world war, and I think that's being set up over in the Middle East and North Africa right now. The Muslim Brotherhood is getting more and more powerful over there, and I think aligned with Iran, you're going to have a confederation there that's going to wind up getting into a very large conflict.
Well, it's interesting. First of all, because I think we all can agree that whatever's happening there, whatever upheaval is taking place, has been fomented probably by us and some other intelligence assets,
right,
for a final purpose, which I do believe is a showdown on the Eurasian continent. But the other thing about the United States too is this: there were a lot of winners in this country. We did have a pretty good way of life. That is not true for all of them, and for all those folks too, they have no voice in history. But we understand that we probably had a little bit better off. But in the end, the world is what the world does, and the governments are what they are. And I mean, semi-kiddingly, I have to say, looking back at the United States, that we were just another plantation, but we had a better recess.
Right.
So, you know what I mean?
Good way to put it.
Yeah. So, but I mean,
the thing is that so many Americans don't realize that the Constitution in the early days of the American Republic, it was set up by people who really did not intend for the common man to, have any real say. It was all to the advantage of the upper class, the elites, and a lot of people just don't get that.
I want to ask you to do this when you get a chance, because Gordon contacted me the other day, and I've said this during the Stuff and Things, and he said, did you look at Montgomery's book? This is the first one he did, probably the first work he did, called The Country Defeated in Victory. And I hadn't gotten to it. I migrated stuff over, and Angie put it up, and John also. I mean, there's a lot of people that are helpful in this. So a lot of the information went through me. Some of it I had not read, and I did not read that his first book online. And in the second part, Gordon just looked at it. It's one of these things where you read it or you look at it, and then it hits you, and then all of a sudden you go back and it hits you some more. I have to admit, in the back 20 pages of the second volume, how Montgomery lays it out, you realize that the fix was in. And really, since 1933, the deal was pretty much closed. You can look at 1866 as being another element in it. That's true, but I would have to say, look, the Civil War wasn't there just for what we thought it was there for. But no matter what, you take a look at that, and I have to say, when you realize what your government did to you under the table, I mean, it's how in the world, honestly, can we expect any kind of change or betterment since the deal is fixed? And if any good people really do go to Congress or the Senate, they soon find out how the deal goes, and they either sign on, which most do, or they go, that's nice, I can't do this, and then, they leave after a term. And I would just say in Florida, Harry always thought that Adam Putnam talked, looked, and sounded like he was the real deal. And I looked at Harry and I said, oh, Harry, come on. I think he was in the part of the congressional district, which Putnam became to represent. Mm-hmm. But you know what happened? And I haven't talked to Harry about this. I think Putnam did, 1 or 2 terms, whatever. And he opted to leave. And I think he's become a Secretary of Agriculture down here. I got to take a look. Yep. But when that happened, when he said, no, I'm not going back, I wondered, and I got to ask Harry, if anything told me that this guy was the real deal, he had to get out.
Well, I think from time to time there are people who are idealistic, maybe a bit naive, but people who really intend to do a good job. They go to Washington. God knows how they get through the process of being nominated by the corruption in the Democrats and the Republicans. But there are occasionally people that go. But if they stay, they have to knuckle under to the corruption.
Yeah.
And that may be the case there. And some of them, might be, half and half. They might really be there to feather their own nest, and they play ball. But from time to time, they try to do the right thing to help people out. It's hard to say. But this Mr. Smith goes to Washington stuff that so many Americans are buying into. And that's the kind of people that the Tea Party preys upon. Those people really mean well for the most part, I would think. They see all this corruption and how bad the government is performing, and they want to change it, and they want that mythological America, that Leave It to Beaver world that they believe they should have here, and it's just not going to happen. But they don't get it.
Well, Montgomery also had a number of quotes from what was done on the congressional floor, and they're there as well. So yes, there were people that still believed, to some extent, in the way things should be, and knew that they were starting to morph. But those voices became fewer until probably the 50s, where they were crushed totally.
Yeah.
And then after that, you got what you got. I mean, don't even tell me about Ron Paul, but, okay, I know. So, I mean, he may do, okay. He does some good things, but, I mean, this guy's not the president. He's not going to be president, and that's all there is to it. He just makes some nice noises and helps everybody believe that the system works, and it doesn't. So, having said those things, why don't we just kill ourselves? What the hell?
Well, in reference to that, there's a new world coming and a new day coming. Jesus Christ there's going to be a second coming, and these things are going to be set right. There will be a millennium, 1,000 years on this earth, and for those who believe in Christ and follow His teachings and principles, those whose names are written in the book of life, who follow the Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world, things are going to get a whole lot better. And that's my message of hope for people out there. And I hope I stated it well.
It's not that. It's just that people, even some Christians now, are saying, well, the reason why you guys want to throw in a towel is because you don't think anything's worth it, that you don't want to try to wail against the NWO. Now, look, it's not pessimistic. It's not defeatist. The thing is, even if I weren't aware of Jesus Christ, the point is that I'm taking a look at this fight. I'm going, there is no way in the world. I mean, it's gone too far. If something could have been done at the beginning of the 20th century, fine. But it didn't. And that's all there is to it. We've got ourselves delivered a nasty situation. And it's not because I say I don't care because I'm going to heaven. That's not about that at all. It's just
No.
the fact that on either side of it, you take a look at it, and man, this is not a fair fight. It is really stacked against decent people, most of humanity, and let's just call it what it is. So, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if this didn't come to pass, then the second coming wouldn't come to pass. These things, God allows these things to happen.
Yeah, but you
whether
see,
people want to acknowledge that or not. And all we can do as Christians is to expose the corruption as long as we can, and to try to bring the gospel to other people and try to show people what's happening. And that's what we're doing as best we can.
But you understand that non-Christians and even some Christians now are saying, you just don't care because you just want to hasten down the judgment, and the tribulation. And it's like, and I understand how they would say that, but it's not the case.
No.
It's not the case.
No.
I've taken a look at the situation. I'm saying, okay, if I'm going to devote anything, why would I devote it to what kind of effort to overthrow the NWO? And and I've said it before, people who carp on me, it's like, well, tell me what you've done. Tell me what the business plan is. What is the model? What are we doing here? And there's nothing. There is nothing.
Who's going to lead
folks.
the charge?
Yeah. Alex Jones.
If buying videos could get it done, I mean, he could stop the New World Order.
Right, put them underneath everybody's windshield wiper in the parking lot, and you'll create a takeover. All right, listen, we're at the end of this segment. Larry, thanks a lot for coming back. And
Sure.
I would ask you, the stuff about Levin, I'm thinking about whether I should put up the audio I did with him speaking directly to Unholy Alliance. To me,
I would like to hear it.
All right.
I'm not sure I've ever heard that.
Okay, I'll pop it up again because to me that's the best thing he ever did.
I'm not endorsing Lavinda. There's some things about Lavinda that I'm very skeptical about, but there's some very good things that he's done. I really don't know where Lavinda stands on certain things. I've seen evidence that he was involved with the occult himself. I don't know. I really don't.
I'll only say
I know that he's considered to be a big time author and historian now.
Well, with Colonia Dignidad, which is what he came on to speak to, I think that was really pretty good work. So
yeah, I think it was too.
Or I'll fish it out and I'll put it up against, along with our links. Okay.
Okay, sure.
All right. So listen, from the great state of Texas, Larry the Contractor Guy. Thanks for being with us, and we know you'll be back again.
All right, I sure will, man.
See you
later.
later.
Have some fun.